Harvard Divinity School.
Yom Ha'atzmaut and the Colonization of American Judaism, April 19th, 2022.
Welcome. My name is Atalia Omer, and I'm a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. I'm also the Dunphy visiting professor of religion, conflict, and peacebuilding at Harvard Divinity School's Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative, which is a part of the Religion and Public Life program. It is in this latter capacity, and together with my colleagues, Hilary Van Tisi, Professor Diane Moore, and Reem Atasi, that I have the honor and privilege to introduce and moderate today's event, which is the seventh in our Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative's Spring Semester series, which is titled Disrupting Injustice and Promoting Moral Imagination in Israel-Palestine. Recordings of prior events are available on our website or are in the process of becoming available. Last Tuesday, we featured the work of Matti Milstein, who is one of our fellows. We featured a conversation about his photojournalistic virtual exhibit titled Walking Through the Twilight, a visual exploration of contemporary Jewish anti-occupation activism. The event involved a conversation between Jewish and Palestinian activists who partake in co-resistance work and who were profiled in Milstein's photographic exploration of contemporary American Jewish activism in solidarity with Palestinians against the Israeli military occupation. Today's event is very much connected to the broader efforts of American Jews to engage not only in solidarity and co-resistance work concretely against the Israeli occupation, but also decolonize or de-Zionize Jewishness itself. The title for today's event is Yom Ha'atzmaut and the Colonization of American Judaism. The event features Rabbi Brant Rosen, who is a Topol fellow at the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative at Harvard. Rabbi Rosen has also been an outspoken rabbinic American protest voice against the occupation and Israeli assaults on Palestinians, and especially since the assault on Gaza in 2008. In this capacity, he co-founded, together with other Jewish critics, Tzedek Chicago, which is a values-based Jewish congregation that has initially defined itself as non-Zionist and recently has embraced an anti-Zionist identity, an outcome of a long process of communal conversation and ultimately a vote to this effect. Rabbi Rosen will present his thesis on the colonization of American Judaism as manifested in the celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut, or Israel's Independence Day, which also denotes the Nakba, or the Palestinian catastrophe of displacement, massacres, and erasures, which, to bring in momentarily the basic insight of Patrick Wolf, the scholar of settler colonialism, the Nakba constitutes not only one event in time, the year 1948, it also is manifested as ongoing processes and structures of violence and control, but also resistance and Palestinian steadfastness, or sumud, which will be the focus of our event next week, featuring another fellow at the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative, Rana Huri, who will be talking about expressions of sumud in Palestinian higher education. So we hope very much that you will be joining next week as well. Today, Rabbi Rosen will discuss his thesis about the colonization of American Judaism and his decolonizing praxis as a congregational rabbi, undertaking an effort to rewrite the religio-cultural script for American Jews. Rosen will be in dialogue here with Professor Daniel Boyarin, who need no introduction, but for the benefit of protocol, I will only indicate that he is the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Professor of Talmudic Culture, Emeritus, at UC Berkeley, where he taught in the departments of Middle Eastern Languages and Culture and Rhetoric for over 3 decades. Professor Boyarin has been the Caroline Zelaznik Gruss and Joseph S. Gruss visiting professor in Talmudic civil law at Harvard Law School this past academic year of 2021-2022. So I'm coming to this webinar from South Bend, Indiana, and I acknowledge my presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who've been using the land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. Today's discussion of the colonization of American Judaism, with a particular attention to the sanctification of Yom Ha'atzmaut, or Israel's Independence Day, as a holiday, marked in synagogues adorned by the Israeli flag, concur with yet another moment of terrible volatility in occupied East Jerusalem, and especially in the Haram al-Sharif, or the Dome of the Rock compound. The current moment once again impresses on us the critical importance of sacred spaces and sacred times and their political force and intersections with political times. This year's convergence of Easter, Ramadan, and Passover in itself cannot explain the escalation in Jerusalem. It cannot explain, for example, the emergence and increased mainstreaming and political validation of the claims of ultranationalist religious Jews to pray at the site of the Al-Aqsa compound and undergo ritualistic slaughter as per prescriptions during the temple period. Such provocative and inciting developments do not only subvert traditional prohibitions against setting foot there outside the messianic moment, but also are backed up by the visibility of state violence as well as necropolitical secretive dimensions. The images of security forces violating the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the worshippers there during the sacred time of Ramadan is a case in point. It doesn't only constitute a violation of Muslim piety in abstraction, it is also the violation of Palestinian bodies concretely, in concrete time, historical time. Well, today's discussion takes us to US religious spaces by way of Rabbi Rosen's work on extricating Judaism from state violence and from the idolatry of Israel, the worship of the Israeli state, and its birth represented in Yom Ha'atzmaut. I thought to start in occupied East Jerusalem and in recent events to highlight the importance of contemporary diasporic Jewish grappling with the realities of Jewish power in which the diaspora is implicated and is complicit. Brant Rosen's reflection on Yom Ha'atzmaut is not an abstract form of hermeneutics, but is deeply embedded in these realities of Palestine, Israel, and how they reflect back upon American Jews. As a way of concluding this fairly lengthy introduction, the words of Yeshayahu Leibovich, the late Israeli Jewish prophetic sage, who called out Zionist state violence for its anti-Jewish underpinnings and who resented with all his scholarly might and sharp tongue the idolatrous worship of the state by the explicitly religious secular movement. With his words, his prophetic insight come to mind for challenging secular Zionists for their political theology and redemptive teleological promise, and for challenging religious nationalism for its totality. Leibovich famously said, and here I conclude the introduction, religious nationalism is to religion what National Socialism is to socialism. National Socialism is not socialism, but its opposite. And likewise, religious nationalism is not religion, but is its opposite. National religiousness, it is analogous to National Socialism. End of quote. With this, I will turn to you, Brant, to share with us your analysis of the sacralization of Yom Ha'atzmaut in Jewish American spaces and your effort to de-Zionize Jewish American life. So please, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Atalia, for that wonderful introduction. I think you helped to contextualize and set the stage for our conversation today really, really beautifully. I haven't heard that Rabbi Leibovitz's quote in a long time, but that could be my whole presentation right there. So thank you, Atalia. Before I begin, I want to express my deep appreciation, first of all, to the RCPI program and Harvard Divinity School, where I've had the wonderful opportunity to collaborate with truly inspiring fellows and teachers over the past 2 years. And I'm also very thankful and honored to be sharing this program with Professor Boyarin. And I thank him for taking the time to consider and respond to my presentation today. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. So just to contextualize a bit, for my RCPI project, I've been writing Jewish liturgy that reflects this unique moment in Jewish history, an era in which a Jewish nation state and the nationalist ideology of Zionism has assumed a prominent, if not central, place in Jewish life. I don't think we can underestimate the powerful and thorough nature of this normalization. So thorough, I think, that it is too often uncritically assumed. In terms of my project, I've been interested in how this normalization has impacted North American synagogue life, and in particular, how it's reflected in our liturgy. And so, the central aspect of my project has been the composition of new Jewish prayers that consciously interrupt the assumptions of Zionism and Jewish nation-statism. Some of these new prayers are prayers we use in my synagogue, Tzedek, Chicago, which we founded 7 years ago, as Atalia mentioned, for Jews who do not identify as Zionist or who actively oppose Zionism, who view solidarity with Palestinians to be not only an issue of political conscience, but as a sacred Jewish imperative. In my presentation today, I want to highlight Zionist normalization in Jewish life by focusing on the holiday of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. I want to interrogate the ways it is observed not only as an occasion for solidarity with the State of Israel, but as a religious Jewish festival, one that is celebrated regularly on the holiday calendar of nearly every North American synagogue. I'll be examining some examples of popular Yom Ha'atzmaut liturgies and exploring their religious and ethical implications. And finally, I'd like to suggest an alternative Jewish liturgical response to Israeli statehood, one that frames the sacred significance of its establishment in a decidedly different way. The creation of a Jewish religious holiday by government legislation is, needless to say, unprecedented in Jewish history. Its origins date back to the period immediately following Israel's establishment, when the Knesset officially established the 5th of the Jewish month of Iyar as the permanent date for Israel's Independence Day, which corresponded at the time to May 15th, and comes out on every year on, depending on how the lunar calendar works out, around that time, given a few weeks before, a few weeks after. At the time, Knesset members were unanimous that this holiday should have, quote, traditional Jewish significance. And in 1949, the new government created a committee to consult with Israel's chief rabbis in order to determine the precise nature of its religious observance. Very quickly, Yom Ha'atzmaut was framed as a day that celebrated not merely political independence, but divine deliverance and redemption. In terms of observance, many of the initial discussions focused on the recitation of Hallel, a series of psalms of praise that are traditionally recited on major Jewish festivals. In terms of newly created liturgy, the template was set by the composition of a new version of Al Hanisim for the miracles, a prayer traditionally recited on the festivals of Purim and Hanukkah that praises God's miraculous deliverance of the Jewish people from their enemies. The first Al Hanisim for Yom Ha'atzmaut was written in 1949 by biblical and Talmudic scholar Rabbi Ezra Tzion Melamed, and it was later published by Kibbutz Hadati, the religious kibbutz movement. And I want to read to you now the English translation of that original Al Hanisim, which has since become the template for many similar versions that have been published throughout the Jewish world. And I'm going to share that screen with you now. And I just want to offer a trigger warning because this is really, really tough stuff to hear. For the miracles and for the redemption and for the mighty deeds and for the deliverance and for the wars that you did for our fathers and for us in those days at this season. You, O God, awakened the heart of our fathers to return to the mountain of your inheritance, to settle there, and to rebuild it from the ruins and its land. And when an evil regime stood over us and shut the gates of our land to our brethren who were fleeing from the sword of a cruel enemy, and they sent them back in ships to the islands of the sea and to distant shores, you in your might toppled his throne and freed the land from his hand. And when enemies rose against us and plotted to destroy us, you in your might sent upon them fear and panic, and they abandoned all their goods and fled in confusion and haste beyond the borders of our land. And when 7 nations rose up against us to conquer our land and to make us as bonded servants, you in your mercies stood by the right hand of the Israel Defense Army and delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, and evildoers into the hands of the righteous. And with your outstretched arm, you helped the young men of Israel to expand the boundaries of our settlement and to bring our brethren up from the concentration camps. For all this, we thank you, O Lord our God, with bowed head, and on this, our day of festivity and joy, we stretch our hands before you and pray on behalf of our dispersed brethren and say, please, our Father, our Shepherd, gather them quickly to your holy habitation, and may they dwell there in peace and calm and tranquility and security. Expand the borders of our land as you promised our forefathers to give to their seed from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt. Build your holy city, Jerusalem, capital of Israel, and reestablish there your temple, as in the days of Solomon. And as we have merited to see the beginning of our redemption and the liberation of our souls, so may we live, and may our eyes see the complete redemption of Israel and renew our days as of old. Amen. So we could spend the rest of the hour just unpacking these words. And again, these words were written for the religious kibbutz movement and was published in a very popular booklet that came out in the early 1950s, but as I said, has really formed the template for versions of Al HaNisim that is widely used throughout not only Israel, but throughout the diaspora, as I'll mention. This prayer uses unabashedly biblical language, refers to the Zionist colonization as an awakening and a return to the Jewish people's inheritance. I'm sure you noticed the reference to the British mandatory authorities, who were really contemporaneous of that time, very much a part of this story and the geopolitical reality. They're referred to as an evil regime. The Zionist militia's dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, which was still ongoing at the time of its writing in the spring of 1949, was ascribed to divine intervention, using images that evoked the conquest of the biblical Canaanites, commanded by God. Similar framing is used to describe the Arab armies that joined the war in 1949. And the term 7 nations is a pointed reference to the Canaanite nations that the Israelites dispossessed from the land in the book of Joshua. The final stanza of the prayer contains a reference to kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles, which is God's promise to return the Israelites to their land following the Babylonian exile. The term is used here according to the tenets of religious Zionism, which views the establishment of a Jewish state as a necessary precursor to the coming of the Messiah. It concludes by looking forward to a return to the widest biblical borders of Israel, from the Euphrates to the Nile, and the reestablishment of the temple in Jerusalem. And just given recent events at the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the Temple Mount, I think this is not just history that we're reading. This is very much the natural progression of this mindset, of this messianic mindset that was embedded from the very beginning in a prayer that was widely and is widely prayed throughout the Jewish world. The religious celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut migrated very quickly to the diaspora. The conservative movement included its own version of Al Hanisim for Yom Ha'atzmaut in its weekday prayer book in 1961, and later in its 1985 prayer book, Sidur Sim Shalom, which they use to this day. The Reform movement, which was historically anti-Zionist, did not include references to Yom Ha'atzmaut in its old Union prayer book, but in 1970, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the rabbinic arm of the Reform movement, formally announced that it would establish Yom Ha'atzmaut as, quote, a permanent annual festival in the religious calendar of Reform Judaism, end quote. Both the Reform and the Reconstructionist movements, which is my denomination, include extensive services for Yom Ha'atzmaut in their denominational prayer books, that include messianic references from prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible. So the presence of these Yom Ha'atzmaut liturgies in the prayers of so-called liberal Jewish denominations attest to the deep influence of religious Zionist ideology on American Jewish life. It is indeed troubling to consider. The prayers of every American Jewish denomination frame Israel's military dispossession of Palestinians from their homes in the context of holy war and ascribe explicitly messianic meaning to Zionist colonization of the land. There is much more to say about all of this, but the question I want to ask now is, can American Judaism stand down this mythic Zionist narrative, a narrative that now assumes religious importance in Jewish life? Is it possible to frame this occasion with a fundamentally different Jewish narrative, one that stands down this redemptive view of militarism and state power? In my own search for answers to this question, the work of several Jewish scholars has become particularly important to me. One such figure is Mark Ellis, Professor Mark Ellis, who has written extensively about the theological dynamics of Jewish empowerment in the wake of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. And here I'm quoting Ellis. In the formation, sustenance, and expansion of Israel, Judaism and Jewish identity has likewise been actively employed, indeed has been militarized, and yes, infected with atrocity. Because once religion and identity become accomplices to atrocity, it must disguise that atrocity and twist it to conform to an innocence and redemption that is now visited as a form of oppression on the other, in this case, the Palestinian people, end quote. For Ellis, the onset of Jewish state power has resulted in an era of what he calls Constantinian Judaism, comparable to the elevation of Christianity to the religion of empire in the 4th century. In the current age, Ellis suggests, quote, dissenting Jews must learn how to practice their Judaism in the shadow of Constantinian Judaism. He refers to dissenting Jews as, quote, Jews of conscience, who he writes, and I quote, are fighting a high-stakes battle against the final Jewish assimilation to unjust power, which, in their view, articulated in overt Jewish language or not, signals the end of Jewish history. Likewise, Professor Sarah Roy, whose work has detailed the devastating effects of Israel's ongoing blockade of Gaza on Palestinians, has written in a remarkable essay entitled A Jewish Plea, I quote, I have come to accept that Jewish power and sovereignty and Jewish ethics and spiritual integrity are, in the absence of reform, incompatible, unable to coexist or be reconciled. For if speaking out against the wanton murder of children is considered an act of disloyalty and betrayal rather than a legitimate act of dissent, where dissent is so ineffective and reviled, a choice is ultimately forced upon us between Zionism and Judaism. Roy then asks powerfully, as Jews in a post-Holocaust world empowered by a Jewish state, how do we as a people emerge from atrocity and abjection, empowered and also humane, something that still eludes us? How do we move beyond fear and omnipotence, beyond innocence and militarism, to envision something different, even if uncertain. My own synagogue, Tzedek Chicago, has been exploring ways to develop a Jewish observance of this occasion as a day of Jewish reckoning, remembrance, and repentance, with a service that combines prayers, readings, poetry, and survivor testimonies. So I'd like to read for you now a prayer that I wrote to be a centerpiece of this ritual. This is what I currently call a Jewish prayer for Nakba Day. Le'el shachafetz tshuva, to the one who desires return, receive with the fullness of your mercy the hopes and prayers of those who were uprooted, dispossessed, and expelled from their homes during the devastation of the Nakba. Sanctify for tov uvracha, for goodness and blessing, the memory of those who were killed in Lida, in Haifa, in Beisan, in Deir Yassin, and so many other villages and cities throughout Palestine. Grant chesed verachamim, kindness and compassion, upon the memory of the expelled, who died from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion along the way. Shelter beneath kanfei hashchina, the soft wings of your divine presence, those who still live under military occupation, who dwell in refugee camps, those dispersed throughout the world still dreaming of return. Gather them, me'arba kanfot ha'aretz, from the four corners of the earth, that their right to return to their homes be honored at long last. Let all who dwell in the land live in dignity, equity, and hope, so that they may bequeath to their children a future of justice and peace. V'nomar, and let us say, Amen. Le'el shachafetz tshuva, to the one who desires repentance. Inspire us to make a full accounting of the wrongdoing that was committed in our name. Help us to face the terrible truth of the Nakba and its ongoing injustice, that we may finally confess our offenses, that we may finally move toward a future of reparation and reconciliation. Le'el malei rachamim, to the one filled with compassion. Show us how to understand the pain that compelled our people to inflict such suffering upon another, dispossessing families from their homes in the vain hope of safety and security for our own. Oseh HaShalom, maker of peace, guide us all toward a place of healing and wholeness, that the land may be filled with the sounds of joy and gladness from the river to the sea, speedily in our day, the Omer, and let us say, Amen. And so there's much I could say about unpacking the imagery of this particular prayer, but I'll just say that the entire prayer is really uses the concept of tshuva, the Hebrew word tshuva, as a foundation, and it plays with the two different meanings of the word. It means both return, to literally return, but it also means repentance, return in the spiritual sense. And the first half of it refers to Palestinian return, it's remembrance and Palestinian return. And the second half dealing with Jewish tshuva, Jewish repentance, moving toward a future of equity and reparation and hope for all who dwell in the land. I'll stop the share now. We can talk more about the prayer. There's much more to say about that as well, and I'm happy to do it. For now, I'd just like to conclude by saying that the kind of liturgical intervention I'm suggesting here is one that is very much informed, as Atalia said in her introduction, by a diasporic context and consciousness. In other words, I'm not merely advocating for the de-Zionizing of contemporary Judaism. I'm seeking to recontextualize the Jewish diaspora as fertile soil for Jewish spiritual creativity, as well as a place of solidarity, not just with our fellow Jews, but with all with whom we share geographic space, and in particular, those who are marginalized and oppressed. In the words of scholar Susanna Heschel, Quote, "The diasporic position is the condition for the prophetic, standing at the boundaries between society and the reins of governance. The prophet demands justice from the governing while giving voice to the unheard who suffer at the hands of the regime." End quote. And with these words, I'll end my introductory comments, and I look forward to now engaging in further conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brant. I now would like to invite Professor Boyarin to react, to reflect on Brant's thesis. Perhaps if you can thread into your remark consideration of Brant's argument with respect to how he is using and drawing on Mark Ehrlich's notion of Constantinian Judaism, the concept of tshuva, the practice, the praxis of tshuva, and this final point about the framing, this notion of the diasporic consciousness as a source of Jewish creativity and solidarity. So, Professor Boyarin.
Well, let me say that I am deeply in sympathy with your political and ethical positions. Let's start from that. I suppose that you knew that, which may be part of the reason I was invited to be here on this day. I'm no friend of liturgy. What can I say? And the only virtue that liturgy has is usually that it's very old, and we don't understand all the words or sentiments that are being mumbled, even by those of us who know Hebrew very well. So there's a kind of sacralization of Yom Ha'atzmaut that is nonetheless taking place in these moves, as that what can I say? It's a question of taste, maybe. It's not my cup of tea, right? One version of sacralization is desecrating. Desecrating is also a kind of sacralization, right? And I'd rather just leave Yom Ha'atzmaut alone. I mean, not let it keep going or leave it to be. That's not what I mean by let it alone. I mean, let it aside of my, I don't believe in Judaism, so I'll say my Judaite completely. I mean, I don't say any kind of a prayer of mourning on Shabtai Tzvi's birthday. And to me, it's muktzah, the whole thing. So I don't disagree with you at all. You know, I don't disagree with you, and it's probably as good as it gets as a quote unquote religious response to Yom Ha'atzmaut. But I personally feel more comfortable in the deeply traditional and traditionalist world of Haredi anti-Zionism, which basically just goes, fat. Then with counter liturgies. This is not a criticism. This is just simply a response. Yeah. Ezra Tzion Melamed, like almost everybody else, was naive. He was also extremely, extremely learned. He was a very important scholar of Talmud and professor. His politics were clearly, his political position was clearly in the direction of Cherut, right? The right-wing revisionist Zionisms that imagined a greater or complete land of Israel. But the reason his poem succeeded was because it really sounds like Al Nisim in Hebrew. In other words, if you recite it in Hebrew, it sounds very much like the ones we say for Hanukkah and for Purims, right? So he caught a certain spirit of the age. I don't think that anything he says there is any more objectionable than what the so-called secular Zionists or anti-religious Zionists were saying at the same time. Because I could modify Yeshaya Leibowitz's bon mot and say that socialist nationalism is equivalent to national socialism also. I don't need a Stopin religion to make that equation. And then we've got Mapai and Hashomer Hatzair and even probably the communist members of the first Congress who, if they really voted unanimously to adopt Yom Ha'atzmaut of the first Knesset, if they really voted unanimously, I don't know this for a fact, I'm just deriving Talmudically from what you said. If it was really unanimous to make Yom Ha'atzmaut some kind of a Jewish holiday, they were all guilty of it. This is not and the whole point of it was to make that thing be a Jewish state and to exclude Goyim, to make them at best, and I'm talking about the most liberal and most progressive, and even the communists, to make the Palestinians, we didn't even know to call them Palestinians then, we just called them Arabs, feel that they didn't belong. And that has been the consistent practice of the Israeli state since then. So I guess what I'm producing is some sort of an apology for traditional Yiddishkeit. The mood of 1950 swept everyone up, swept people up who became the founders of Matzpen when they woke up a few years later. I guess, let's all sit and learn Gemara. That would be better than reciting newly made poems and liturgies. Again, not that there's anything wrong with the poem that you wrote. I would correct one thing, but not online. I'll share that with you. So we're allies. We're in coalition, but
all right. So sorry. So maybe we can start with the dialogue. I just wanted to highlight two things that I heard in this response, and of course there were many more layers to it. One is a point about this exercise in counter liturgy. Is it useful, meaningful? Kind of exercise, is it necessary? So Professor Boyarin, you think no, it's not necessary. I also hear what I found very interesting is kind of different points of departures, because for Rabbi Rosen, his point of departure seems to be very relational with respect to his responding as a Jewish person to the claims that Palestinians, the moral claims that Palestinians are making, and on him as a Jewish person that is complicit in power and abuse and displacement and the Nakba. as ongoing. And the argument that you made just now is more within a Jewish framework that is not necessarily also relational. I mean, you don't preclude the relational, but you say, let's just sit and study Torah. And so I wonder, Brant, if you want, like, how would you want to respond initially to the points made?
Sure. Or maybe to your last point, that what Daniel is saying, that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the relational happens outside the realm of the synagogue and the liturgy, the liturgical, that is more of a political relationship than one that takes place within the context that I've been describing. I think we're coming from two very different places, obviously, and two different approaches to Judaism. I don't daven the traditional Jewish liturgy. That's not my liturgical context. I'm not a traditional Jew in that regard, and so my relationship, my understanding of what Jewish liturgy is or could be is just could or should be is very, very different. And I think I'm part of a community that is seeking to create contemporary liturgies that are rooted in Jewish tradition, but that respond to realities, the given realities of our time. I want to say that I don't look at this as a new version of Yom Ha'atzmaut or a new response to Yom Ha'atzmaut. I don't think what I'm suggesting has anything to do with Yom Ha'atzmaut, actually. So in that regard, I'm with Daniel in that I'm happy to ignore it. I'm happy to let it go by. But what I'm suggesting is that, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, I think that the founding of the State of Israel had a cataclysmic effect in so many different ways, certainly for Palestinians, but also it had a deep and transformative effect on Judaism as we know it. And I see the work that I'm doing, the project that I'm embarking on, as trying to create a Jewish response to this moment, not an alternative Yom Ha'atzmaut, or even a Jewish response to the events of 1948, but to the reality of Constantinian Judaism, of the fusing of Judaism and state power, and have that be reflected in our liturgy. I mean, the community that the synagogue that I'm a part of would not be content just to study Gemara and ignore Yom Ha'atzmaut. I think they feel compelled to find some kind of Jewish response to the spiritual and ethical significance of this moment that we're in, that is so overwhelmingly transformative, not just historically, but every single day, which you mentioned, Atalia, in your comments, in terms of the settler colonialism is an ongoing process. The Nakba is happening as we speak. So it's both a liturgical intervention, but also just a suggestion for opening up what we might consider to be a religious Jewish response to the very unique time in which we live.
I just want to correct one thing. I don't make a distinction between religion and politics in the way you suggested that I do. I could be heard that way. But I guess ultimately, I'm not looking for a Jewish response to anything that's happening in Palestine. I don't recognize it as Jewish. If I have a choice, which is not that I don't feel a deep sense of responsibility for the Palestinians, which I enact politically in many ways, and at a fair degree of personal cost. But I don't know exactly how to say this. I think we have a double responsibility in that sense, a responsibility that we take on ourselves of the bad behavior of Jews, that we take responsibility for and fight against. That's a part of Jewish solidarity. As I write in my forthcoming book, Jewish shame is an important part of Jewish identity, and Jewish resistance to Jewish evil is an important part of Jewish identity. But the passion of Tikkun Ha'olam is do, here where I am. You know? When I lived in Jerusalem, my primary activity as an activist was Palestinian solidarity. But now I live in Berkeley, and my primary concern is the oppression of Black people by American police.
Which, Brant, maybe that's an opportunity to bring in kind of the broader framework of the broader values framework of Tzedek Chicago and that kind of prefigurative Jewish community, how it connects also to Hereness.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I tried to allude to that in the end of my comments in terms of, and this is something I actually learned from Daniel in terms of this notion of being a diasporic nation, that you live in, at least two nations at the same time. And that one is a sense of solidarity with your Jewish community, your Jewish, Am Yisrael, and but also the Jewish community of the location where you happen to be living, and the your neighbors with whom you share space in the geographic place in which you live. And from the very beginning, our congregation, our synagogue, was involved in work in Chicago that was very focused on building relationships with local groups that were struggling for liberation on so many different levels. So we didn't see our work as Jews of conscience standing with Palestinians as somehow separate from that. But part of these two different realms that kind of intersected in a Venn diagram, perhaps. So it's very diasporic in that regard. One of the first things we did on Rosh Hashanah, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, was we had an action at Chicago City Hall in solidarity with Chicago Teachers Union, who were in the midst of a very landmark strike, actually, at the time. So this is part of the continuum of the work that we do. There's much more we could say about how we balance this work and the significance of this work, living in the diaspora versus if you were living, as Daniel said, in Jerusalem, where you're literally sharing geographic space with Palestinians. It's very different for us living in the diaspora. I agree.
Yeah, but this brings to the foreground that, it's obviously it's not either or, because kind of engagement, liturgical, as well as other modes of engagements, Brant, that you've kind of engaged in and practiced over the years are both relational, because you are very much, as a Jewish person, confronted by the realities of Jewish power and abuse and violence. So the Constantinian dimension, but also in understanding that this process of reimagining Jewishness, as exemplified in Tzedek Chicago, is also intersectional, and that actually to be in solidarity with Palestinians is also intersecting because Palestinians see those intersections in their struggles with Black Americans,
Right.
Black and Brown Americans. So those sites of engagement are interconnected. And this very much comes into the kind of hermeneutics that you are doing, right?
Yes, and it's interesting because right now we're in the midst of a bit of a transition, because when we started, this was before the pandemic, obviously, and we were very, very geographically specific to Chicago, even though we had members who traveled from, outside of Chicago, sometimes far outside of Chicago, to be with us. It was still very much bound up with the geographic space in Chicago. So we have cultivated deep relationships with other grassroots movements, including Palestinians who live in the Palestinian community of Chicago, by the way, who also are part of this greater community. Since the pandemic, we've gone online with our services, and we're not very local anymore. I mean, we still have a core in Chicago, but we literally have people joining us every week from all over the world. So it's Tzedek Chicago, but it's a global Tzedek Chicago. And, it's forcing us to refigure what it means. We're coming face to face with the diaspora in a way we never expected. We have people from New Zealand who come to Torah study every week, and it's like early Sunday morning when they join us. And so, the notion of how important the sharing physical space is when we talk about being a diasporic Jew. Right now, we're trying to figure out what that means when we're largely virtual, almost completely virtual still. But I think there's something about place. I agree. There's something about place that is absolutely important, and you can never. There's no substitute for that.
I'd be happy if the police started doing all their work by Zoom.
Great. Well, I actually, on this note, I want to introduce a few of the excellent questions that came from the audience. And so I'll try to do my best to convey most of them, or kind of the gist of the questions. So one from Iliana, who writes, "It doesn't surprise me that Reform Reconstructionist and conservative liturgy adds Hallel with a bracha to commemorate a recent political event. What is shocking is that modern Orthodoxy and religious Zionism, which at least in theory are concerns about concepts like bracha, levatala, and don't freely change liturgy, have accepted these liturgical changes so freely. What does that say about modern Orthodoxy and religious Zionism and their commitment to liturgical continuity, and how that interacts with their access to power?" So
I'll just, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the books that was very important in my own research and the essay that I wrote, which was much more expansive than the presentation I gave, was this book. It's called the Koren Machzor for Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. And Koren Publishers is a very important traditional Jewish publishing house, and it's filled with liturgy for Yom Ha'atzmaut, including it has very many different versions of the Al Hanisim, including Melamed's, and an anthology of essays by major Orthodox figures, both in the diaspora and from Israel, about the religious significance of the holiday. That this is an example of what Ileana was just saying, that the thorough embrace by the Orthodox community in Israel and in the diaspora of turning Yom Ha'atzmaut into a chag alongside all the others on the religious Jewish calendar. And as not being part of that community, when you say what does it say about them, that's not for me to say, other than I find it deeply troubling.
And at the first Yom Ha'atzmaut, they asked the Rosh Yeshiva of Ponevezh, Rav Kahneman, what he was going to do about liturgy for Yom Ha'atzmaut. He said, "I follow Ben Gurion's custom. Ben Gurion doesn't say Hallel, I don't say Hallel. Ben Gurion doesn't say Tachanun, I don't say Tachanun.
But maybe to audience that is not immersed in this language, maybe you can explain what those means, those words mean.
Hallel, Rabbi Rosen talked about the Psalms of Praise, and the question that was raised now was many Orthodox congregations say it without a bracha, we should say, without a blessing also. But what the Panovich was saying with a fair degree of cleverness and irony is that Zionism is not our project, but following Ben Gurion's custom indicates the separation between a project that's on the border between kosher and treif and liturgy. So I think I was trying to answer also the question. I didn't catch her name. Yeah.
Iliana.
And just one more sentence.
Yeah.
Let's not forget when we say Orthodox that there is a great deal of variation and dissent. There's no official Orthodox body. Koren is a thoroughly Zionist, militaristic publisher. I mean, I'm not saying this lets them or anybody else off the hook, but need a contextual. They print the Bibles for the army, and I have been doing that for the last at least 50 years. And so there's a lot of variation, a great deal of dissent. I've just spent a wonderful year here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, doing my own liturgical life at Chabad, Harvard Chabad, and I haven't heard the state of Israel mentioned once the whole year. So, a relief.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this. So maybe a final question, start with you, Brant, about, again, going back to kind of the point of orientation, this relationality. When you think about Jewishness, you think about it relationally with respect to the historical moment. And complicity and obligation to Palestinians specifically, but also, as we talked about, intersectionally to other struggles and injustices, and that are interconnected. So, so this is to say that you are very that your hermeneutical work is very attuned to suffering of others. So it's kind of a Jewishness that is other-centric. And so my question is, how do you bring it together with the narratives of Jewish suffering? So how do you negotiate those questions in your work, in your praxis?
You're muted.
Thank you. So much of Jewish ritual, whether it's the holidays or life cycle events, the history of Jewish loss and Jewish pain is very palpable. I mean, it's impossible to get away from. It's part of the fabric of our tradition, and that's the way it's evolved. I think there's always a sense of trying to negotiate how, what constitutes valid and important Jewish recognition of our pain and Jewish mourning for mythic events, whether it's like on Tisha B'Av, when we're remembering the destruction of the temple, but of course it's refracted through so many other moments of Jewish loss. And how do we balance that with the loss that's all around us by people, again, with people with whom we share geographic proximity. And that balance will be different for different people. We just finished Passover, and it's getting in the progressive Jewish communities becoming something of a joke that every year you put another thing on the Seder plate, for this oppressed people or that oppressed people, and pretty soon we're running out of room on the Seder plate for all of these different people, and there's no way you're going to be able to find room for everyone, and so there's that side of the equation, but it's also a holiday that commemorates, Jewish liberation. So I think in the case of the state of Israel, and again, this is, I think, where Daniel and I differ in terms of our approach. This is an event that emerged in the aftermath of a horrible Jewish cataclysm that we're still, that is still very much contemporaneous with us now. The Jewish nation that so many Jews consider to be this divine redemptive moment, the establishment of a Jewish state, was created on the backs of another people and occasioned the dispossession of another people. And so that adds an additional level of complexity, to the way we're going to recognize this, whether it's politically or in our ritual life, which is, again, something that I've been trying to suggest that it's important to do so. So, the answer to your question, Atalia, is there's no single solitary way to do that. I think it's, it's finding a constant attempt to find that balance. And it's what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora, really, I believe.
Thank you. Professor Boyarin, do you want to reflect on this question? No, you're muted.
Yeah, not particularly. I find myself in agreement both with your formulations, Atalia, and with Brent's, and I'm just, I guess, not a liturgical person. For me, the function of davening is to connect with the past, a mythical past in part that goes all the way back and constitutes the Yiddish folk, Jewry, as we ought to say in English, I think, not the Jewish people, but Jewry, and find other ways to express and live the pain of solidarity with people who are suffering every day. The hard one for me, frankly, is the Ukrainians. As long as Khmelnytsky is sitting on his horse in the middle of Kiev, and I won't say Kiev, I really find it hard to, no question that I think what Putin is doing is horrible and wrong. That's not, but I can't develop a great deal of emotion.
I think that we are concluding this session with a lot of kind of fruitful tensions and areas of, please forgive me for using a liberal language, of overlapping consensus, but important tensions. I think that it's also important to acknowledge as we conclude that a lot of the conversation about Jewishness and Jewry really has centered here Ashkenazi Jews and Europe, and it's important to bring into the analysis the experiences of Jews in Arab and Islamic countries, also as they are unfolding within the context of kind of the ideological framework of Euro-Zionism as it plays out in the contemporary moment. So there is, I just, as we were talking about suffering, I was thinking of the classics, Edward Said essay on the Zionism from the perspective of its victims, and then Ella Shochat's essay, Zionism from the perspective of its Jewish, Mizrahi, or victims. So perhaps, even though it's not a terribly satisfying place, we will conclude. And I want to thank you both, Professor Boyarin and Rabbi Rosen, for engaging in this conversation and for the important work that you are both doing in different ways.
Thank you so much, Atalia.
מועדים לשמחה.
חגים וזמנים לששון.
Gam lecha. Thank you to Daniel.
Thank you.
Sponsor, Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative.
Copyright 2022, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.